Let's talk about strategy. Let's talk about who really shapes strategy. Is it AI, data, or the invisible power in the C-suite? Who is it? When we talk about leadership and strategy, you know, there are some seats still available if anybody wants to come in, because then it's helpful for us as well. Wonderful. So when we talk about leadership and strategy, we sometimes focus on formal power, like org charter, like titles. But EqualVoice has shown us something else. Sometimes the visibility shapes influence, and influence shapes decision, and that influence is not always equally distributed. So what can we do about this? And that's why I have this great panel with me, because we want to get inside of this strategy and what really shapes strategy. With me today, I have Christine GRAEFF. Christine GRAEFF is the Global Chief Growth Officer of FS Global. It's the leading strategic communication and advisory consultancy. She works closely with top leadership teams, helping them navigate through transformation, power dynamics, and strategic decision-making at the highest level. Christine, thanks a lot for having you here. We have with us LEILA TOPLIC. She is an internationally known, recognized expert in AI ethics, trust, and responsible technology. As Chief Communications and Trust Officer at Carbonfuture, it's an climate tech company. You are a board member and you work exactly on this intersection of AI governance, sustainability, and social impact, focusing on how trust and accountability are embedded in both leadership decisions and AI-driven systems. And Brittany Kaiser was mentioning the EqualVoice assistant earlier on. Actually, LEILA, she is the head of this EqualVoice assistant. It was her idea to use AI and to integrate this as well in the EqualVoice movement. Great having you. HARALD Port, you are the founding partner of PVL. It's a known consultancy in Switzerland, and you advise organizations on leadership, on strategy, on long-term value creation, with a strong focus on how influence, trust, and decision-making truly function at the top. Great having you here. Thanks a lot. Well, let's set the stage and let's talk a little bit about visibility versus power. And it's an opening question to all of you. EqualVoice shows that visibility and influence are unevenly distributed at the top. In today's C-suite, in today's C-suite, who actually shapes strategy? And how do AI, data, and informal power dynamics change that? LEILA, won't get to get started, please.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and it's great to be back at this venue. So maybe just to start with how and who actually shapes strategy overall, and then to talk about what is the role of AI and where I see it going. So strategy is really shaped by whoever does three things. One is framing the question. What is the problem that we're solving? And then defining what inputs, i.e. data, are needed to address that question. Second is executing, and that's the analysis and the synthesis. And third is evaluating and making the decision. Over time, AI has gotten really good at number two, which is the synthesis and analysis. So what the role of human is, which also includes women, is getting really good at number one, knowing how to frame the question, and also being the one who knows how to evaluate that output and make the decision. So our opportunity here is to make sure that we do have women knowing how to do that, how to frame questions, and also be the decision maker at the end, and not take AI's output as the kind of the neutral and the final decision.
Wonderful. HARALD, what about you?
Well, I'm going to build on your definition of strategy. I really like that, how you were framing it. In terms of who really shapes it, I believe it's not really so much the formal roles that we're seeing. So you could say it could be like a CEO, a head of strategy. It could be the executive board. I think it's really, if you look behind the scenes, it's much more about who are the voices who are exactly shaping that, to your point, question, right? Who is looking at the scenarios, who is bringing in the assumptions. And then whenever that is done early in the game, those are the voices that are shaping strategy. And that can or cannot be the people who are actually have that formal role, but I think it's much more about who's actually doing that rather than who has that role. And when it comes to AI, I'm going to take the stance here that AI is actually more an influencer of that of what I just mentioned. So it's really accelerating those voices that are being heard through the right questions, through the right prompts, through the use of data, and making decisions about which data and which analysis and which insights are actually going to be used.
Christine, what is your point of view?
So building on both of you now, so I fully agree with what you were saying. It's the official title, that's the theory. But the real importance is actually who shapes the narrative. And one of the key elements of shaping the narrative is shaping through the questions. And I think that's also where I would, again, thank you, because the work you're doing with EqualVoice, that's where we're seeing that who owns the narrative is very often not the experts, or at least not enough female also voices. The other thing, if we're turning to AI, it influences, but it gives data, and if people aren't prepared, you will all of a sudden all tilt to the left, or all tilt to the right. But where I think, again, it's coming back to owning it, is giving the context. And that's what people always forget. It's not just about hallucinations, it's about understanding the context. And lastly, and it's a point, and I'm seeing a colleague of mine here in the room, I think is super important in this age. Influence comes through networking and different perspectives. So one of the most important things is to build a network and build a network of different perspectives.
Christine, you have not been only with your company now, but you have been with Credit Suisse and the European Central Bank. So from your experience, where is sometimes a gap between the formal role and the real influence? And how is this even emphasized now, this gap reinforced by data and technology?
So the interesting thing is the formal role is important because you sit in the decision-making body. And so sometimes you have two elements. You have competence which is not sitting in that body, or you have competence that is sitting in the body but doesn't get to be listened to, doesn't have the visibility. And there are elements, and I think that's where we come to the role of leaders later on. So for instance, at one of the institutions I worked in, we had mostly the managers were men, but people drafting the reports were female. And so we said, for instance, that while the managers would always sit in the room, the people who had actually drafted the report would come. Or the other things, and that's again is a super important one linked to KPIs and to data, is I don't know how many of you have heard when you're talking about promotions in career, and that's where the CHRO is so important. Yeah, but he or she lacks gravitas. I mean, what is gravitas? Is it to be tall? Is it to have a deep voice? What is it? And if you then have data and KPIs that you can use to shape it, that will really make the difference. And then maybe finally on data and AI, I think there's two aspects to it. It can either be a real negative, being used as bias or being used as selective information, or it can be a real leveler because it democratizes the information and really gives access to everyone.
Leila, exactly to this answer, what is your experience in regards to how do algorithm or data models shape strategic influence today? And is it good or bad?
It's a good question. So maybe just to have a conversation first about what is influence and how does it get shaped. So influence gets shaped, or influence is the ability to shape what gets considered. So it could be at the board level, it could be at the factory level, how it's framed, and then which options feel legitimate. So that's basically what influence is. When we introduce algorithms into that, I'm going back to the three things. It is really about how we're framing the questions, what questions we're asking, what is the task that we're asking algorithms to solve. Second is what data we're giving it to the algorithm to base that decision on. And then third is how we evaluate that output. it all starts with a human, really. So algorithms help us filter our reality, but all of that happens upstream with a human decision maker framing the question, selecting the data, which includes all of our biases, and then ultimately at the end, being the one to take that output and make a decision on whether to push on it because it might not be right, or to take it as a neutral decision to implement. So what is really important to consider is the role of humans. So going back to asking the question, executing, and then evaluating. We need to get better at asking non-biased questions and framing the problems in a non-biased way, providing non-biased data, and then also making sure that the evaluation and the decision-making sits with us.
Harald, whose voices are being heard in strategic discussions, and how is the process changed by technology?
Yeah, I think it's a really very individual answer there, and I think every company and every organization really gives it its own spin. Because let's be honest, I mean, strategy is something that means it's important to us. And who do we listen to when it's important, right? We start to listen to the people who we trust, to the people that we know well, and we think they can really help us. And they may or may not be the ones who actually have that job title. And so I think the key thing what executives and leaders really have to consider is don't confuse participation, so having a role in a discussion, with actual influence. It means you're actually contributing to making decisions. And I think that's where AI, again, is accentuating what leaders are doing today. AI is just making the data much more accessible. We can frame the questions, we can pose the prompts, we can decide on what is included and what is not included. In the end, it's still people. People who are asking the question, people who are interpreting. And so those voices, I believe, those voices who are using the AI, who are framing the data sets and the questions and the assumptions that are there, those are the ones who are actually shaping the strategic narrative. And it can or cannot be that role that they've been given.
At EqualVoice, we were talking a lot about the visibility gap that especially women see. In regards to our panel now, have you seen cases where a lack of visibility, not a lack of competence, limited strategic impact? What about you, Christine?
Well, I've got two examples, and one of them actually I can talk about because it has been published in the case of Credit Suisse, which, as I think most in the room would know, went down. We had risk issues. We had a big scandal around Archegos. We actually had people who had raised the point that the client was not fulfilling its obligation, and raised it more than once, but it was ignored. So it was exactly that. It wasn't a competence topic. The competence was in the house. It was escalated, but it didn't get listened to. And I've seen it, and this I think happens a lot in transformation, and whether we call it restructuring or transformation, that is next to resilience, I think one of the words I've heard most this week. Transformation fail if someone doesn't get to really, at the board level, getting the ear to saying, these is where the issues we have. This is why we're not moving forward. And the interesting thing is the visibility gap is a real risk management issue. Because very often it's like communications, it's like reputation, it's like trust. How do you measure it? But if you lose it, it becomes a huge risk. You can lose your business. So I've definitely seen it, and interestingly, I think we will be seeing it more, and that's a little bit one of the concerns I have.
Have you seen it, Leila? So
maybe, I love that example. I think it's really helpful to illustrate it. Maybe just to take a macro point, we're seeing Gen AI play an important role in how we actually reach decisions. So just going back to doing the analysis and also helping us evaluate different options. So if you look at some of the recent research, so Harvard Business School published research based on analyzing 143,000 individuals, 18 studies, that basically show that women adopt Gen AI on average 20% less than men. And even with the equal access and with training, it's 13% less. So what that means is that we will see impact. This is not just the individual impact on adoption, but actually impact on who influences these decisions. So what would be really important, again, to focus on adoption and a safe and responsible usage of generative AI in the boardroom, in the meetings, in any of the decisions, and making sure that that's actually equitable.
Harald, have you seen any cases where competence was in the room, but visibility was not given?
Yeah, I think there's actually, if I think about a strategy process, there's really like 3 points in time where it really matters. And I think one is really at the beginning, really at the outset. So when people come together and they start to formulate ideas for the next strategy, assumptions, scenarios, that's really critical to get the different perspectives. And if you think about leaders, why are they leaders? Often it's because of a competence. A functional competence. They become leaders because of a functional competence. And so they're in the room and they want to represent that functional competence. So you will hear them talking a lot. And I think the key thing here when we're talking about a visibility gap is actually being able to listen. Listen to different perspectives, listen to the different voices, listen to the different people who can really share about what the direction could and may or may not be. So I think at the outset is really one point where that is absolutely key. I think then at the interface between strategy and then execution is again an absolute key, because now we need to get the message close to the people who are close to customers, close to people in operations, close to the people who understand the risks. And that's not necessarily the same people who have defined the strategy. So again, here the visibility gap comes into play where it's those people who have defined strategy are not necessarily the ones who are going to help with the execution. And then finally, I think a third point is during execution, where I'm working with leaders and again time and again is when things get a little bit muddled, when things are a little bit uncertain. Who do you go to? And I think that's where leaders tend to focus and go back to trusted people, trusted individuals. That can be the right person, but more often than not, it's not the person who's actually close to customers, close to risks, close to having the right answers about where they need to go. And that's, I think, one of the key things to watch out for when you're talking about gaps and bringing the right people into the room to help solve those issues at that time.
Can I just pick up on that?
Exactly.
I think that's what's super interesting is the listening angle. And I was talking yesterday to a senior executive in the pharma world, and they said they had 2 bad product launches. And they actually had the data to track that they went back. You had the people who then went through the whole trial process, etc., but they had not listened to the customers. And then they basically stopped it, reshaped it, did exactly what their customers wanted, and it went off through the roof. So those listening skills, and it's still, and this is also a question as to, I think, how hierarchies, how organizations will be structured in the future. You still very often have those silos which stop the listening, or if the listening takes place, stop you from actually sharing it. So how will organizations, organizational structures look in the future, and how will they be shaped by AI is also something that's super interesting.
Could I add something to that? Sure. So it's super, sorry, we're going off script, but I think it's super interesting because I want to connect the dots to the role of AI, because both in the office, in the boardroom, at the factory level. So one thing just to for all of us to consider is that we're moving from the world of org charts, because we talk about C-suite, but really to the world of work charts, where there's specific work to be done. And then there's specific expertise to be leveraged across that workflow that includes both machines or agents and humans. So we really need to consider what is work and what does an organization look like in the future. The second, which is why I love this conversation, we oftentimes focus on how do we debias AI? Is AI fair or not? Well, how do we actually use AI to debias ourselves and our systems and make ourselves potentially more customer-centric, more equitable, and just more collaborative? So there's an opportunity to instead of automating bad processes and bad data, to take a step back and think about how we use AI to actually redesign work and fix the things that are no longer working for us.
Definitely, Christine, you made the example of listening actively to your customers. But what would be your recommendation for the leaders here at the World Economic Forum in Davos? How can they ensure that they get those diverse perspectives? So one thing is listening, but then somebody had to raise their voice. So how can you ensure as a leader that you get all those voices, all those different perspectives?
I think that there's two elements. So first of all, often enough we go into meetings and we have an idea. And already just having an idea stops you from listening properly. And interestingly, I did a coaching qualification years ago, and that was the most difficult, was active listening. And one piece of advice I was given, and I thought that was super helpful, is they said, if you're thinking of the smart answer you're going to give, you're not listening, because you are focusing on what you're going to say. And actually just own it, that if you're intensely listening, you may not have an answer immediately. And you can say so, like, what you've said was, I'm reflecting on this. And then someone I used to work for, that was another, it's kind of a funny piece of advice, but when you put it to work, he said, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And that's for a very good reason. You should be listening twice as much. But I think to your more important point on how do you make sure that you get a diverse perspective, is trying to look at the problem and think, okay, who's impacted? Who has a view? Who should be driving it? What can be long-term consequences? What can be unintended consequences? And we just, with my firm FJS Global, we just did and it shocked me actually. We launched a research which we do every year. But one of the things this year was the absolute divergence in points of view between the elder generation, should we say, and the younger generation, but literally opposite views. So I think what I would always do is make sure that you have younger people, and let's say more mature people, and also that you have really different regions, because what it means in Europe may be completely different in Latin America, may be totally different in another view. And then data, yes, but always remember that data, sometimes people say data speaks for itself. It absolutely doesn't.
It lacks context.
It lacks, exactly. Context is king. People say content is king. No, context is king. Again, at Credit Suisse, we had, because of what happened, we had to do a risk dashboard. The easiest thing is to game it. Your breaches of risk limits go down. It was because you raised the raise limit. You raise the limit, so it goes down. Or how many issues you have in terms of people misbehaving. Well, people say, the numbers go down. That's great. I said, no, we're just being more lax, so they will go down. So you always have to really analyze the data. And I think if you do all of that, you're probably 90% there. You're never fully there.
We could continue for hours, but actually it's already the last round. So I love always to have call for actions. So Harald, what would be your call for action for the audience?
Yeah, I think I'm not going to surprise you here, Annabella. I think you know me well, but I'm super passionate about choice. So the choices that we make, and I think the issues that we're talking about, visibility and impact in the strategy process here, is about too often looking at org charts, roles, and then choosing those people on those roles and those org charts to help make it a strategic decision. I think we would be much better off, and this is what I'm passionate about, is let's map influence. Let's map voices that are contributing. And before any CEO or anybody who's responsible for a new strategy goes out there and launches that strategy, just do a map about which voices actually help to shape the strategy and which didn't. And then think about, is that the right flow? Were those the right people? Or do I actually need maybe a couple more voices here, different perspectives? Do I need to listen in a different way in order for the strategy to really be impactful and powerful, and make that choice? And then I think you're ready to go live.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harald. Lea, what about you?
I'll address the individuals in the room, not just leaders, but all of us are leaders in our own spaces. Just going back to, again, what is strategy and what is uniquely human. So being able to ask the right question, which in the age of AI, knowing how to prompt engineering, get really good at that. Get really good at defining what problems we need to solve and what is the question that's important for an organization to focus on. Second, get really good at evaluating something that will be the combination of AI and a human. And then third, understand how how the options get into the room. So earlier, like really understand who actually prepared those options and how did they get into the room to make sure that you are actually making the decision that is equitable and right for like whoever you're serving in terms of the customers.
Wonderful. Christine, what about you?
Well, this is perfect segue, because you see some options. Think about the options that you are not seeing. You know, where are other options, or why are you giving a certain set of information and not others? So basically, rather than just looking at the set of data and saying, okay, and focusing on that, also wondering what else would there be and why am I not being shown this? That's one element. And the second one is take action, but also own it, take responsibility. And to a certain degree, while this has been a kind of weird Davos, I find, you know, with President Trump and everyone expecting it, the one positive for me is that the Europeans seem to now take action and own it, and I hope they will. But I think certainly for each and every one of us, you're the only one, you know, you started out this being a strategy, you're the only one who owns your strategy. And it doesn't matter how tough it is, and there will be, you know, there will be setbacks. Own it. You know, think about it, use the data, get different perspectives, and then own it.
Wonderful. I think this is a great last sentence. We are all aware strategy is never neutral, but ensure that you own your strategy. Thanks a lot for this great panel.